Hello, I'm Dawn Durham, and welcome to PaTTAnpod. We're here at the National Autism Conference, joined by Dr. Francesca Degli Espinosa. Thanks, Francesca, for joining us on PaTTAnpod today.
Thank you for inviting me.
We're so excited to have some conversations with you. I want to talk for a minute about some of the work you've been doing. You've been doing a lot of work around sequences relative to social and verbal skills for students with autism.
That's right.
And what I want to think about, what are some key elements for a curriculum to address when we're looking at social communicative skills for students with autism?
Well, it has to be a major element of our curricular objectives. What really distinguishes autism as a disorder from other types of disabilities and developmental disabilities is that it's really a disorder of social learning. It's not the intellectual impairment per se that's the problem, and language, although it's impaired, is not the primary deficit. The main issue is the ability to learn within a social context. So if we think of social context as really the kind of realm in which, the arena in which we move as humans and learn many skills through social interaction to maintain social interaction, so these skills emerge as a result of that interaction within the social environment, then if social stimuli are either diminished in value or irrelevant, as they are typically in autism, with individual variation, of course, then you can see how all learning that normally occurs within the social context is necessarily, as a consequence of that, also reduced or impaired. So I think any curriculum that specifically aims to address the learning needs of this population, and I've only ever worked with children with autism, has to address the issue of learning within the social environment. And we can pretty much teach anything through understanding contingencies, and we can pretty much bring most behavior to occur under stimulus control with tangible reinforcers, reinforcers that are unrelated to the social interaction. But the question is, should we? And should we place our efforts in trying to develop a technology that establishes social stimuli as relevant and important, that then can enable the child to acquire the skills that are normally learned through social interactions, through the sort of more conventional means of acquiring them rather than in contrived teaching situations. And I think it's a big challenge for us to do that, and it's one that we haven't really tackled. And so understanding what social stimuli are, what qualifies as social motivation, what qualifies as social attention, and why it's so valuable to most of us, will provide us with a good basis to then develop a sort of framework of objectives that attempt to address that. So that's what I talked about this week, and it was mainly about establishing early social responding and looking at people because they're interesting as the first and the earliest social response, the first operant response that the social environment, the first response that the social environment can acquire operant control over. So if we can establish that early on, the value of people, then we may save ourselves a lot of trouble in later.
So really honing on the fact that it's social learning and it's the context, and as you had said, learning more about that and really kind of harvesting that knowledge to go through and to build frameworks that would show the relevance and the importance of that factor.
Yeah, so if we think that most of our learning occurs in the social context, if those stimuli are not important, then you're not going to approach them, and you're going to be deprived of many opportunities. The environment is going to be able to provide you with those opportunities. So if we can kind of establish the value of social interaction very early on, and responses that recruit social interaction as a reinforcer and are maintained by social interaction and occur because of that. So these kinds of early responses would be looking at people because they are valuable, because when you look at them, good things happen. Joint attention skills, responding to social cues and smiles and variations in expressions, showing things. So we can do that with very early children, with very early learners, through something that's called joint activity routines, which is a model borrowed from an intervention model called the Early Start Denver model. And but if we superimpose on this an analysis of an applied behavior analysis, then what we have is something called social behavioral chains, where we can sort of get children engaged in this kind of chains of interactions in which what I do will evoke behavior on your part to then get me to do more of that. What distinguishes social stimuli as reinforcers from inanimate objects is that social stimuli derive their reinforcing functions from actions of others. So the sort of function is the same as inanimate object. They can increase behavior, they can strengthen the relationship between antecedents and behavior. But there's a fundamental difference, and it's that unlike inanimate object, they derive their functions from the actions of other people. So we want to establish the actions of other people as meaningful and necessary to achieve what the child wants. So when we say we're mediating reinforcement, we mean that we become the only people through which that reinforcer can be achieved. And so in very early interactions, we do that through social sensory routines, where, for example, if the child likes movement, spinning, he can't really spin by himself, and he can't tickle himself and generate the same response. And so we build these kind of routines so that there are signals that he's now expecting, and we pause, and the child may give us an anticipatory response, may look up, may signal with a gesture that he wants the thing to continue. And so we can establish this kind of interactive dance that goes back and forth and shared control.
I think that those are some important facets to remember. It's that building up those social interactions and encouraging and recognizing when we need to continue with that process. I want to pivot here for a moment. I've been told that you have said that effective instruction means that students are verbally present. Help me understand, what does that mean by verbally present? What are you trying to say there?
It's actually effective learning. So and I know exactly who became fascinated by this term, because it's Mike Miklos.
He has shared with me that this is something he hears you say often.
He does hear me say
so
often. So
I want to ask, what do you mean by that?
In a specific context, actually. In that, and it really it builds upon this notion that we're not just passive listeners. When we're in school, when we're, listening to someone giving a lecture, or when we're receiving classroom instructions, we're not passive receivers of information. So listeners, effective listeners, are also active speakers, except that they're the only ones privy to their own speaking. So by being verbally present, what I mean is that as events occur in the sort of daily activities of the child has. How do we know that the child is contacting those stimuli, that he's actually engaging with the environment? Because you could be sitting in a classroom and look like you're engaging, but actually you may be engaging in verbal behavior under the skin that's completely irrelevant, that doesn't correspond to whatever is happening. So I kind of talk about being verbally present in the context of, for example, reading comprehension, listening to a story. How do you know that your child has paid attention? And you say because he can answer questions about the story that's been read to him. But that's after the event. So what happens during the event? What is the child doing? And there's no behavior that you can actually see other than he's looking and sitting and looks like, but you don't know that he's actually paying attention. And how do we define that? So it's sort of verbal behavior about the ongoing event. And if you deviate too much from that, so kind of multiply controlled tacting, a complex form of tacting, then you have daydreamers. You have, you stop listening. If I start now thinking, okay, well, I'm going out for dinner while I'm talking, you're asking me a question, my verbal behavior doesn't correspond to
what's happening here.
What's happening in the environment. Then I'm no longer verbally present. Okay.
So it's that internal talk that you're doing. Is it present and relevant to what's happening outside the social interaction?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a lot of verbal behavior does occur under the skin at a certain point. And so I guess the example I give is with regards to what people may traditionally call memory or the behavior of remembering. What is responsible for that? How do we define it? And so if I ask someone, well, I can see you're married, and if I asked you, do you remember your wedding cake?
I do, yes.
Can you visualize it?
I can, yes.
How many layers it had, what color it was, the various decorations. Okay. And now I'm going to ask you, can you remember, and I don't know how many years ago you were married.
17, it was a while.
Right? So something that happened so long ago. Okay. But if I asked you, okay, can you remember the birthday cake that you may have been given 5 years ago?
No.
Still
I mean, I can make a guess.
Isn't it?
No, yeah.
Okay. So why? You would say...
Doesn't hold as much sentimental value?
Okay.
Perhaps.
Yes. We have to define sentimental value. So some people say, well, it's not such a salient event. A wedding is something that occurs, hopefully, not many times in one's lifetime.
One would hope, yeah.
But where is the control for that? You know, do you have a mental image that you pull out? Or, you know, where is it? Where is this behavior of remembering? And it's sort of, there are kind of two processes at work. The behavior you engaged in at the time of the event, and the behavior of recalling that event, the kind of problem solving that you're going through. Okay, you know, maybe visualizing the pictures and so on and so forth. And so there are these kind of two distinct behaviors, but unless you were present during the event, not just physically, you're unlikely to be able to recall it at a later stage. Because basically what you're engaging in recalling is in verbal behavior that's not entirely novel. Because you've already engaged in verbal behavior at the time of the event. You talked about it, hopefully as you were cutting the cake, you were thinking and talking to yourself about the value of,
and what we're doing
of the event
and
the cake. And it had both sort of it elicited the event a lot of kind of condition, a lot of sort of emotive responses, as well as a lot of verbal behavior. You were verbally present, and as in your verbal behavior, private verbal behavior, occurred in synchrony with the actual event. So think about children in the classroom who are often subjected to lengthy verbal explanations. And then they're unable to recall any or only some facts, despite having good language understanding. That's for all students. And the teacher says, you weren't paying attention.
But maybe it's that internal verbal
But what's probably
response.
happening is that teacher's behavior doesn't hold as much interest for the child. That's one explanation. For him to engage in behavior that corresponds to that. And so when we're listening, we're doing a lot of things. Sometimes we're echoing. Sometimes we're transforming what someone is saying in ways that's more understandable to us, so that we're able to say the same thing. We may be visualizing. So there are a lot of things that are happening that we're doing, and that's what I call being verbally present, is engaging in covert verbal behavior that corresponds to the event that's ongoing. It may be a visual event, so you're observing and tacting what's happening, as well as a verbal event where you're kind of engaging in a cascade of verbal responses from echoic to intraverbals, saying things in different ways. And when you understand, you do exactly what you're doing right now.
Nodding and giving some kind of symbol.
Absolutely.
Well, so that leads me though, and then how do teachers promote the acquisition of these verbal repertoires, effective verbal repertoires? How do we promote that in our classroom and our students?
Okay, so there's a lot, there's a history of sort of, there's a long history of technology for promoting active listening or active student responding. So there is a technology, there are specific procedures which involve, in sort of simple terms, sort of delivering frequent checks and opportunities for the child to demonstrate learning with the material that's just been presented. So the way we work, and I work a lot in Italy, which is my country of origin, where we don't have special schools and we don't have special classrooms. So the children are all all children with a variety of multitude of disabilities are educated in the mainstream environment. Now this holds both advantages and disadvantages. But what we have found, so we can't, choral responding is not something that we can do. It's just, it doesn't, it's too novel. It's not. Teachers have their own way of teaching, and it tends to be a very didactic model. So with a lot of kind of passive learning, as they call it. There's no such thing as passive learning. So what we do is we do something called listening checks. So every couple of minutes, and this is obviously for the learners who can access some sort of traditional teaching in the classroom. So if the teacher is, talking about the parts of a plant in a science lesson, then we'll cue our learner to listen. We'll just say, make sure you're listening. And then we run every couple of minutes a listening check, which is a question generally about the material that's just been presented. Or it'll be an observation check, so asking him what he's looking at. And what we do is then we differentially reinforce the responses that the child gives as demonstrations of whether he's listened and paid attention. So if he's been verbally present. And over time, we make these listening checks less frequent, so the child is having to remain present for longer chunks of time. But this way, then we establish this kind of chain of events where to get that point, I need to be able to answer the question. To answer the question, I need to be paying attention. And we give them strategies. We teach them sometimes to echo. Sometimes we provide keywords on a board. So there are a number of strategies that we can put in place to ensure that the child is maintaining contact with the material, with the teaching material, when we can't actively get the teacher to establish sort of corresponding and active sort of listening. So
holding these listening checks or these observation checks really allows us to, every couple of minutes, kind of ascertain whether or not our kiddos are being verbally present.
That's right.
But it allows us to extend that time then too.
Yeah. And also to establish it in itself, because all the pre-current behaviors necessary to get that answer then get established as part of that reinforcement contingency.
So there are some aspects that we want to be thinking about when we think about applying this to instruction is embedding and implementing some of these listening observation checks, as you said, every few minutes, but then kind of pulling away that scaffold and extending the time period to eventually we get to a pretty decent chunk of time where the child is able to be verbally present and therefore actively engaged in this learning and the process. So I think that's good piece of advice to give.
Yeah, and sometimes what we do is we teach children to take notes. So we'll cue them and say, that's a good, take notes. And so they're not being asked the direct questions, but they're having to write down
kind of what they synthesized.
Just sometimes it's just keywords, and then they use those as cues to recall.
I think that's good strategies for any student, right? Whether it's a student with autism or just a student in general at any grade level, in any age level, to be able to do that too. So I think that's good pieces there.
one story I tell my students is, I said, well, if you think I'm boring when I'm talking, you should have met some of my professors. I wasn't a very good high school student. I scraped by. I went to Italian school. It's very hard. But I scraped by, but university was a different ball game. I kind of really had to be, to learn to pay attention. And some lessons, they're just not interesting. So they have no reinforcing value. And the value of escape into kind of my own verbal behavior was very, very high. And so to self-manage my tendency to kind of daydream and not be verbally present, I made myself be verbally present by taking notes. Because you can't be thinking of something, you can't be having covert verbal behavior and take notes at the same time about what's going on. And so that's how I made myself engage.
So I think that's interesting to think of us as an adults and young adults, and who may need that help with knowing and recognizing that sometimes they're not as verbally present as we'd like them to be. So I think that's good. I think that's good information. I want to ask you this, and we ask this of all of our guests that visit PaTTAnpod. We want to inspire educational growth in those who are viewing and listening to this episode. What advice might you offer to those who are out there to grow professionally? There's quite a lot of advice that I can give. I can tell you what I have found useful, in that I received very different training in Europe than most behavior analysts receive here. In that I kind of had a multitude of mentors that I kind of have had to seek the attention of kind of independently, because it's just very different, and doctoral programs are very different. And the one thing I learned from a very young age was not to be afraid to ask questions, and attend conferences, and don't be afraid to go up to the speaker, whoever that person may be, and ask questions. You may not want to do it in public, but there's no such thing as a stupid question. So don't be afraid to do that. And I could give the sort of standard advice to read. And if you're going to be reading, my suggestion would be to read outside our field, and because it is interesting stuff out there, and I think it's important that we challenge ourselves in terms of applying our science in understanding how other people have viewed the same phenomenon. And we tend to complain that we do not sit at the table of mainstream psychology. And I think one of the reasons is that we tend to be very presumptuous about what we know compared to other people. And we tend to have our own vocabulary and terminology that, unless you have had such a high level of training, is incomprehensible. It may be English, but it's not. It holds no kind of stimulus control over someone who doesn't have that repertoire. And I think sort of we have to be able to communicate with professionals who may view the same phenomenon in a different way. And so that's the other thing, is sort of read outside our science and apply the behavioral lens to the way other people may have described the same phenomenon. And I found that invaluable. I found that very, very useful, and I was made by my teachers to read outside behavior analysis and understand how other people have looked, for example, at joint attention, how other people have described memory. It doesn't mean that we renounce what we do, but we have to understand also what how other disciplines have looked at the same thing. So I think that idea of challenging yourself and reading outside of your field, and then going back to that, don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask about it. Don't be afraid to kind of question it and say, well, I'm pushing back a little because I'm not sure. So creating that cognitive dissonance is not a bad thing, to be able to grow. And that's a good thing.
And we all love to talk about hard work. So, we always welcome questions. I mean, they're wonderful opportunities for us as well to sort of give back to the field and to students.
And I think a place like the National Autism Conference is a great opportunity for folks to do that, to come and approach speakers who maybe they've never heard before, or have read something about, but be able to go up and ask them. And I think a place like this is such a welcoming environment to do that. And I'm sure folks have come to you throughout your sessions today and other days that have done that, and we've heard of other attendees who have been speaking with presenters. So I think that's the key piece, is don't be afraid to ask the questions.
Don't be afraid to ask questions.
No, I think that's great advice. Thank you, Francesca, for stopping by PaTTAnpod today. We so appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of you in the field. You inspire educational growth in your students every day. A special thank you to John Ragsdale for producing this podcast. We'll see you next time on PaTTAnpod.